Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and this is your horoscope for Gemini rising for the entire year ahead for 2021. So, we're going to look at this from the perspective primarily of your rising sign for those with your ascendant in Gemini. You can also look at it from the perspective of if your sun or moon is in the sign of Gemini, although rising sign is preferred. All right, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So here's the planetary movements calendar that shows where the planets will start at the beginning of the year in the signs of the zodiac and how far through the signs of the zodiac they will get by the end of the year. So we've got some major transits going on for you this year. This should be a significant transit or significant year for those of you with Gemini rising. The big thing that I wanted to focus on at first is Saturn and Jupiter have moved into your ninth house of education and philosophy, travel, foreign things, foreign people, foreign places, as well as one's religious or philosophical beliefs. So they have moved into the sign of Aquarius, where Saturn will be transiting for the next 3 years, and Jupiter will spend the next 12 months until December of 2021. So that's the sign that they recently formed the Great Conjunction in December of 2020. So in your ninth house of education and philosophy. So this is kind of a big deal. Saturn's longer 3-year transit can sometimes indicate a period in which you run into some obstacles or difficulties or delays, setbacks, or in which you have to say no to or reject or negate some things in that area of your life. So sometimes this can be kind of a challenging process, but in the long term, it's usually like a constructive thing that's necessary in order to grow and move forward as a person. So sometimes what seems like, really difficult, unfortunate setback at the time can later end up leading you in a direction that you wouldn't have gone otherwise, and that can ultimately be constructive and valuable. So Saturn's more difficult, or somewhat difficult, but still potentially constructive 3-year transit that's just beginning now. You did get a preview of that last year. In between early April and late June, Saturn dipped into Aquarius for a few months and should have given you sort of an idea at that time where some of these ninth house themes should have started to come up in your life in some way. And that was giving you some sort of foreshadowing of the more significant long-term 3-year transit that is fully in effect now as of December of 2020. So that gives you some idea of that. While some of that could be more challenging or have more setbacks or more difficult, one of the positive things this year is that Jupiter has also moved into Aquarius at the same time. So, and especially for those of you with day charts, Jupiter's transit through Aquarius during 2022 should really help to balance out and moderate some of the tendencies of Saturn. So whereas Saturn tends to conserve and consolidate, Jupiter tends to indicate growth and expansion in those same areas. So growth and expansion when it comes to education, philosophy, you could start a new educational direction in your life and move quickly to expand in that area. You could develop a new philosophy or religious outlook. You could also have some exposure to new cultures or new people who come from cultures or backgrounds that are different from your own, and you could benefit from that and grow as a person during the course of 2021. So that's a very more optimistic transit to help balance out some of the more serious or more heavy indications from Saturn this year. All right, so that's one of the things I wanted to look at. The other thing I wanted to look at is Uranus is transiting through your 12th house, and it's going to be your 12th house is typically one of the more difficult houses. It tends to indicate things having to do with solitude and sometimes seclusion or loss. Uranus can be somewhat sudden or indicate disruptions that come from people who work at cross purposes to you, which traditionally in like ancient astrology was referred to as like your enemies. So Uranus transiting through the 12th can sometimes indicate unexpected disruption that come from enemies or people who work at cross purposes to you. Uranus will be forming 3 exact squares with Saturn this year, and that's the reason why I bring this up. Because even though a 12th house Uranus transit is otherwise not very major for you normally, there will be some tensions between Saturn and Uranus this year that could indicate some instability or some disruptions. And for those of you that have planets around between, especially, let's say, 7 degrees and 13 degrees of the fixed signs, this may be particularly relevant for you in your life because Saturn and Uranus will make their first square at 7 degrees of Aquarius and Taurus in mid-February, February 17th to be exact. Then they'll form another square on June 14th at 13 degrees of the same signs, and then finally one more exact square at 11 degrees of Aquarius and Taurus on December 24th, 2021. So that's an area where there could be some tensions between sort of consolidation and tradition versus innovation and going in a new direction. And that may manifest in particular in the area of religion and philosophy for you, and something about places of solitude represented by the 12th house, which more traditionally can sometimes indicate places like libraries, hospitals, ashrams, sometimes jails or prisons or other things like that, but basically just places where one is removed from the world in some way. And something unexpected and somewhat surprising coming from that area of your life at this time. So that's one of the transits that will happen during the course of the year. At different points, Mars is going to move into the fixed signs, and it's going to emphasize that square between Saturn and Uranus. So in January, Mars will square Saturn around the middle of the month and then conjoin Uranus in the sign of Taurus. Later in the year, in early July, Mars will oppose Saturn and square Uranus. And then finally, in early to mid-November, Mars will move through Scorpio and it will square Saturn and oppose Uranus. So that may act as sort of like a trigger or a sensitive point that could exacerbate any of those topics that might already be sort of in the background for you and bring them a little bit more to the forefront at that time. All right, the other thing I want to talk about this year that's probably more front and center and is more important and relevant to you is the ongoing eclipse series that's taking place in Gemini and Sagittarius, which is your first house of self and your seventh house of relationships or other people. So this eclipse series already started in 2020. It started back in June where there was a Sagittarius eclipse, and then especially in late November and early December of 2020, there was a Gemini lunar eclipse and a Sagittarius solar eclipse. So it really opened up a series of eclipses that will be taking place and becoming much more front and center this year in 2021, where my keyword for eclipses is great beginnings and great endings. And this would be applied in particular to your first house of self, which can indicate or include things like your body and physical vitality, or also your character and sort of mental vitality, and some great beginnings and endings when it comes to that area. So some people change their appearance, they change their hairstyle, they gain weight or lose weight, they start doing things to improve or change how they appear to other people mentally or intellectually in some instances. Basically, it's just about it changes to yourself and how you perceive yourself and how others perceive you. And sometimes that can be little things that seem trivial, and other times it can be things that seem much more significant and much more major. But for you, subjectively, they'll probably feel notable at the time in some way. So it's about balancing your commitment to yourself, but also because we'll have some eclipses taking place in Sagittarius. That's actually the first eclipse that happens in May, a lunar eclipse in Sagittarius, which should indicate some sort of culmination of events when it comes to the sphere of relationships and partnership in your life. So the seventh house is Sagittarius for you. So any themes that have been going on, especially since December of 2020, in terms of relationships and in terms of starting new relationships or winding up old ones, you should see a culmination of those efforts take place so that what you started back in December will become clear and come to some sort of fulfillment when that Sagittarius eclipse takes place in your seventh house in May. Around that time, or about 2 weeks later, there will be a Gemini solar eclipse on June 10th, and that was in the first house, and that was what I was talking about earlier. Later in the year, we get a bit of a shift, and there's a partial lunar eclipse in Taurus, November 19th, and then a total solar eclipse, which is the last, I believe, of the Gemini Sagittarius eclipse series on December 4th in your 7th house. So another like great beginnings and great endings taking place in the 7th house of relationships for you in December of 2021, bringing that whole series of eclipses to conclusion. So by that time, whatever balance you were trying to make between your own personal responsibilities and needs versus the needs of other people in your life and other close personal one-on-one relationships should sort of come to completion at that time. And what you'll see then is the eclipses starting to shift, especially in 2022, to Taurus and Scorpio, which is your 12th house and 6th house axis. So again, emphasizing with the Taurus eclipse themes of kind of like solitude and needing to be a little bit, to pull back a little bit from the world in general and from some relationships. Whereas 2021 has been much more relationship oriented of self versus other. 2022, as we move into it, I think you might be drawing away from that just a little bit. And you'll start getting a series of eclipses in your 12th and 6th, which can also relate to focusing more on physical and mental health as like important parts of your life, and in order to balance out and bring optimal sort of health and wholeness to your physical and mental life. But that's more of a theme for 2022, so I shouldn't get ahead of myself too much. All right, so those are the eclipses. The last thing that happens towards the end of the year is that Jupiter ingresses into Pisces and moves into your 10th whole sign house of career on the 28th of December 2021. So this is the beginning of a transit of growth and expansion when it comes to career matters, your reputation in the world, as well as just your interaction with the public in general and superiors in your life, or anybody that plays the role of a superior. So there will be a little preview of this transit earlier in 2021 when Jupiter just barely dips into Aquarius for a couple of months, starting on May 13th when it moves into Pisces. But then it will go retrograde, I think, at the first degree of Pisces by the very next month, basically by June. We see Jupiter stationing retrograde there on the 20th of June. And then by the end of July, Jupiter retrogrades out and goes back into Aquarius and back into your 9th house of education. So what that means is that you get a preview of what this 10th house growth and expansion period will mean in terms of your career right there in the third quarter of 2021, but it's very quick and not very lasting. It's just a foreshadowing of what's to come as a much more major trend that will largely take place in 2022. But I wanted to mention it to you now because it's the transit that you end the year with in December, and because we get that nice little preview period, so it should be something that you pay attention to and you watch out for, because any themes that come up at that time in your career will become much more central and much more major once you go into that transit full-fledged in December. So that's definitely something to look forward to. The only other thing I have to mention that's unique to Gemini risings this year is that there's 3 different Mercury retrograde periods, and they all take place in the air signs. So in the signs of Gemini, your rising sign of first house of self, mind, and body, your 9th house of education and philosophy, where we had those other transits going on with Jupiter and Saturn. And then also there will be a Mercury retrograde in Libra in your 5th house of children, creativity and creative expression, and sex and sexuality. So you can pay attention to those 3 Mercury retrogrades this year as probably relating to those specific areas of your life, and they may be more relevant to you for those of you who have Gemini rising, since then Mercury would be your ruling planet. All right, I think that's it in terms of transits that I wanted to mention. That's the major like bird's eye view of the major transits this year. You can check out the Astrology Podcast Year Ahead Forecast for more detailed breakdown of the different months over the course of 2021. But otherwise, I think that's it for this year ahead forecast. So thanks for watching and good luck in 2021. And I'll see you again next year for the year ahead forecast for 2022. So good luck and take care. Many of the images and calendars that were used in this episode are now available as posters on the astrologypodcast.com website. This includes our 2021 planetary alignments calendar, which shows all of the ingresses and retrogrades and lunations this year. the planetary movements calendar, which shows how far through the signs of the zodiac each of the planets will get during the course of 2021, and also other posters that we have, like our significations of the 12 houses poster, so that you can personalize and understand how each of these transits relates to your own birth chart. We also recently released our 2021 Auspicious Elections Full Year Ahead Electional Astrology Report, where Lisa Scheim and I went through each of the next 12 months and we picked out one lucky date, which would be good for launching new ventures and undertakings using the principles of electional astrology. So you can find out more about that report at chrisbrennanastrologer.com. Thanks to all the patrons that supported the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on Patreon. In particular, thanks to the patrons on our producers tier, including Nate Craddock, Marin Altman, Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Michelle Marilot, Christy Moe, Ariana Amor, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Sumo Kopic, and Nadia Habhab. For more information about how to become a patron or have your name listed in the credits, please visit patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Also, special thanks to our sponsors, including the Northwest Astrological Conference, which is happening online May 27th through the 31st, 2021. Find out more information at norwac.net. The Mountain Astrologer magazine, which you can find out more information about at mountainastrologer.com. The ISAR Astrology Conference, happening August 18th through the 22nd, 2021. More information at isar2020.org. The Honeycomb Collective Personal Astrological Almanacs, which you can find out more information about at honeycomb.co. Also, the Portland School of Astrology, more information at portlandastrology.org. The AstroGold Astrology app, available for both iPhone and Android, available at astrogold.io. And finally, the primary software program that we use on episodes of the Astrology Podcast is called Solar Fire Astrology Software, which is available at alabe.com, and you can get a 15% discount with the promo code AP15.